I think we're going to continue with the no introductions, although I already introduced René Aguigah, Ben Ratskoff, Hannah Black. Bios are in the programs. Welcome. Thank you for being here. This is very exciting for me. I laugh into this and then don't, but it looks like...
Okay, sorry. Laugh with you.
Ben, thank you for your talk. That was very interesting. I was wondering whether comparisons between the Holocaust and the Black experience were less controversial, although closer in time to the events when Baldwin was writing, and if so, why or how that's changed, if you have any idea.
Yeah. You know, it's quite interesting because so the short answer is yes, it changes in every context, right? Over time and place, the sort of frames of comparison and the reactions to comparisons change. Precisely, and that's part of what I was trying to show, right, is that even from 1962 to 1967 to 1970, right, in the context of his own evolving relationship to the civil rights movement, his own comparisons changed, right? His own methods of comparing changed. So comparison takes place in an actuality, right? It's not just about memory. It's about now too. It takes place in the now for a certain reason. So that is in a nutshell, I would say. In terms of specific reactions, you know, to Baldwin's comparisons, it's interesting because before the war, in 1936, W.E.B. Du Bois spent about 4 months in Nazi Germany, and he wrote a number of columns for the Pittsburgh Courier while he was there, you know, denouncing the anti-Semitism, right, trying to kind of analyze the Nazi anti-Semitism. And when he came back, a German newspaper had reported, a German-American newspaper you know, reported that Du Bois doesn't think that the situation of blacks in the South and Jews are comparable at all. And after this was published in the German-American newspaper, the head of the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, wrote Du Bois a frantic letter, right, saying, did you really say this? What do you mean they're not comparable, right? And so we see that in that moment, he was desperately wanting the comparison, right? The precise opposite of what has become in a post-war moment, you know, a rejection of comparison, right? So that in the moment of fear and desperation, right, in a moment of actual politics, the comparison was going to have meaning for the American Jewish community, was going to communicate something to American audiences. And so that's just to point out, like, absolutely, right, is that in just every moment here we see how the context of comparison, who is making comparisons, to what end, right, all shapes how they are received. Because ultimately, comparison is a very basic and banal kind of practice, right? I mean, it's just we do it every day in small ways in our life, right? I mean, it's not, there's nothing really controversial. It's those contexts that I think charge it.
Hannah, did you do you have a story about comparing sort of Jewish and Black trauma, or like just any like sort of like
in general?
I
I
mean,
think well, I mean, I was going to say
up also.
Oh no,
yeah,
I'm
no.
not doing that. Okay, but whatever. But like I mean, there is a certain competition, right? I also a friend who's Black American person who's dating a white Jewish person was said this really well. I thought it's like. She was like, we are each other's analogy, kind of. I think there's a sort of like weird back and forth texture, but I was kind of interested in something, well, I mean, something I wanted to say on comparison in general. I think while it has a sort of like, maybe not exactly harmless, but has a sort of everyday quality. I mean, of course, it's possible to make comparisons across different forms of, oppression and state violence and so on, in the same way that, maybe in an ordinary conversation, you'd find points of similarity with another person. At the same time, I think there's, perhaps you could critique it in that it obscures actual systematic imbrications, kind of. Yeah. So I think something that obviously was referenced in the previous talk, I think, would be the idea that there was an actual borrowing by the Nazis from American race law and so on. So that would be something more, maybe a bit stronger than a comparison, and would be an actual kind of like, you know, like globally interlinked white supremacist capitalist project or whatever. So, but yeah, I think it's really interesting the ways that I think because in some ways. I mean, maybe this is true for any narrative of racialization, but I feel like there's ways that Jewish and Black people feel a special claim on a kind of like global. I think because of the status of transatlantic slavery and the Holocaust and so on, as like these kind of massive ruptural kind of events. I feel like there's ways that they kind of, there's a sort of recognition of scale of claim, kind of in a weird way. I mean, I'm quite fascinated by this attempt by academic called Highland White to kind of do a sort of like anti-Black, I sent it to Ben recently, this anti-Blackness version of the Moshe Postone argument, where Postone tries to relate Nazi anti-Semitism. He's like, well, you know, tries to do this argument around Nazi anti-Semitism and the value form, where he's like, the Jews came to embody this like problematic, abstract function of capital, and like that's in terms of its like exchange value. And then so obviously like Highland White makes this counter argument that's like the kind of inevitable one, where it's like, well, Black people in the ways that anti-Blackness often emphasizes this kind of excessive embodiment or a kind of like, or laziness or whatever, they kind of represent this sort of function of abstract labor or of a kind of like, yeah, the sort of use value of labor or something. And so I think those on that level, I feel like they have these like intense structuring things. But I think it's really interesting in the American context, and I thought wanted to hear more from you on this, because I have the impression that over the course of the 60s, in terms of Black radical politics, there's an analogy shift where initially it's like Jews are, you know, Black people have some attraction to like the idea of Jews as analogy, and then they move towards Palestinians as the subject of analogy, because actually there's and you know, not just as a comparison, but again as like an actual relation where it's like, okay, we're both suffering from a kind of global white supremacy, and that's the actual. So I don't know if that's something you looked at. Or?
I'll just say, first of all, I completely agree with you. I mean, you know, I think the limits of comparison for me are not at all relativization, right? It's that it occludes relation. I mean, it occludes real-time relationships, whether it's the Nazi jurists studying American race law, right? Whether it's obviously that concentration and deportation and internment, you know, take place in contexts much wider than Nazi Germany, right? I mean, so that those relations are what are occluded when we basically say, here's one case, right? Here's another case, and we're just going to compare them, right? And like on a ledger sheet. So yes, I completely agree with that. In terms of this sort of shift, yeah, I think, you know, it's really interesting. I mean, because there is even an older history, I mean, and Alex Lubin has written about this in terms of Black internationalism in the interwar period and Palestine. But you're right? I mean, there's obviously a key shift that happens, and I would say, in the late 60s, it's a rather overdetermined moment. I mean, there's a lot of things happening at once, right? Which is that, you know, SNCC is expelling all of its white members, right? Losing all of this funding from white Jews at the same time that the 67 war in Israel and Palestine, right, is happening and is shifting kind of this anti-colonial global consciousness, right? At the same time that Black Panthers are like concentrating in Algeria, right? Which is like a site of solidarity with Palestine, right? So it's like this incredibly overdetermined moment of all of these different factors that I think you're right, like absolutely kind of did shift those, like what is the object, what is the reflexive analogy, so to speak, right? Like what is sort of the immediate thought? And then there's obviously, you know, material conditions that matter, right? I mean, and there are many scholars who have written about sort of white Jewish embourgeoisement, suburbanization. I mean, all of these things in the post-war period, sociologists and others, you know, have documented, and that's just was a very big shift from obviously the immigrant and working class communities that were relatively diverse in urban contexts before, right? And obviously, the site of the Communist Party, especially, was a site of a tremendous, you know, collaboration between Jews and Blacks in that period. So, yeah.
René, du beschäftigst dich, I'm going to do it in German, du beschäftigst dich in den letzten Monaten mit Baldwin intensiver, wie ich weiß. Und Hast du irgendwie Beobachtungen, wie Black Jewish, also die, sagen wir mal, die Vergleiche zwischen schwarzem Trauma und jüdischem Trauma in dem amerikanischen Kontext gelesen werden und wie wir hier darüber denken oder wie das auch öffentlich wahrgenommen wird im deutschen Kontext? Solche Vergleiche jetzt.
In Deutschland?
Ja, also wie liest
ja.
man Baldwin aus den 60er Jahren heute in Deutschland?
Ja. Zwei winzige Vorbemerkungen. Ich muss mich bei den englisch sprechenden Menschen entschuldigen, dass ich jetzt auf Deutsch spreche, aber mir, also insbesondere bei euch beiden, aber mir ist das Thema zu heikel, um in meiner nicht ersten Sprache zu sprechen. Meine erste Sprache ist Deutsch. Das Zweite, was ich kurz sagen wollte, danke für diese sehr, sehr, sehr schöne und sehr klare Konstellierung dieser 3 Texte von James Baldwin, die mir sehr einleuchtet, auch um zu zeigen, was sich bei ihm da verändert hat. Zu der Frage Baldwin in Deutschland und vor allem Baldwin in Bezug auf Black-Jewish Relations in Deutschland, würde ich vielleicht erstmal gerne kurz sagen, es gibt in Deutschland nach meiner Beobachtung jedenfalls gerade so eine Baldwin-Konjunktur, vielleicht ein Baldwin-Hype. Vielleicht gibt es in Amerika auch, das würde mich interessieren. Ich glaube, dass der zusammenhängt mit diesem Biopic von Raoul Peck von vor ein paar Jahren. In Deutschland hängt es auch zusammen mit der Neuübersetzung, die es gerade gibt, seiner Texte, auch seiner Fiction übrigens, bei DTV. Außerdem ist Baldwin all around on Social Media. Also man kommt nicht durch Twitter oder Insta, ohne ihm auch zu begegnen. Gut, es hängt von der Timeline ab, aber zumindest, ich würde sagen, viele Bubbles auch um meine herum würden das ähnlich beschreiben. Und ich glaube, ein letzter Aspekt, der diese Konjunktur möglich gemacht hat, ist, dass Black Lives Matter mit dem Tod von George Floyd nochmal ein bisschen Luft unter die Flügel bekommen hat, zumindest ein paar Wochen, ein paar Monate, dann wurde alles schwierig. Und ich glaube, dass in diesem Kontext Baldwin auch nochmal neu zitiert wird. So habe ich das jedenfalls auch in Deutschland wahrgenommen. Jetzt gibt es in Deutschland aber natürlich eine besondere Situation, die hier die ganze Zeit immer wieder zitiert wird. Und ich glaube, dass es naheliegt, dass wenn Leute ein bisschen gründlicher Baldwin lesen würden oder extensiver lesen würden, dass sie dann durchaus über Sachen auch stolpern müssten in Deutschland. Also dass es eigentlich neben dieser großen Umarmung und neben diesem großen Hype auch Stolpern geben müsste. Beispielsweise, was in deinem Talk, Ben, gerade als dritter Text da auftauchte, diese Vergleiche Angela Davis mit der Housewife nach Dachau oder Schwarze, die den Weg zu den Gaskammern unterbrechen und so. Das ist ganz sicher nichts, was deutsch Sozialisierten leicht über die Lippen geht, und da muss ich mich einschließen. Und auch ich würde sagen, dass ich das auf gar keinen Fall in jedem Kontext so wiederholen würde, sondern ich müsste mit dem Menschen, mit dem ich darüber rede, und so erstmal klären, was verstehen wir unter Vergleich und in welchem Kontext und wie ist das alles, wie meint man das? Also ich würde da so die Bedingungen des Vergleichs, hätte auch ich das Bedürfnis, das genauer zu klären. Jetzt gibt es aber tatsächlich auch Beispiele, vielleicht, Emily, wolltest du darauf hinaus, wo deutsche Leser auch wirklich stolpern. Und wo ich nicht mit stolpere. Ich habe ein Beispiel mir rausgesucht. Der Kommentator, der Baldwin-Kommentator heißt Thomas Klatt, ein Religionsjournalist. Und der Kontext ist eigentlich eine Kommentierung der Frage, ist BLM, ist Black Lives Matter antisemitic? Der Text ist erschienen in einer Publikation namens Die Tagespost. War das jetzt, gut, also irgendeine Reaktion. Ich habe jetzt leider nicht orten können, die Reaktion. Ich möchte aber ganz kurz zitieren aus diesem Kommentar. Der Kommentar, der lautet insgesamt, Black Lives Matter hätte eine Vorgeschichte in Intellektuellen wie Baldwin, die sei judenhassend, und auch Baldwin hätte gelegentlich seinen Hass auf Juden formuliert. Und jetzt kurz 2, 3 Sätze zitiert. Der Jude als gnadenloser Mieteintreiber und skrupelloser Geschäftsmann, ein klassisches antisemitisches Narrativ. James Baldwin ist heute in den USA Schullektüre. Und dieses letzte ist heute Schullektüre, ist empörend gemeint. Dagegen müsse man sich gesamtgesellschaftlich wehren, sagt Doc Wilker vom American Jewish Committee. Zitat Ende dieses Kommentars in dieser Publikation namens die Tagespost, die in den letzten Jahren von manchen tatsächlich auch einfach als rechte Publikation eingeordnet wird. Insofern passt dieses Zitat für meine Begriffe ganz gut in den Kontext dieser Konferenz. Diesen Kommentar möchte ich zumindest mit einer Sache kurz kommentieren. Der ist aus dem Text, den du in deinem Vortrag als zweites hattest. Negroes are antisemitic because they're anti-white. Ich glaube, dieser Kommentator versteht etwas fundamental. Also fundamental hat er diesen Text nicht verstanden, weil Baldwin beobachtet eine bestimmte Envy und so weiter, Neid, Schuldzuweisungen und so weiter, die er in Mid-Century New York City genau beobachtet. Das ist klar situiert und er beobachtet und kommentiert es seinerseits. Und diesen Hass, den Baldwin beobachtet, reflektiert, einordnet, über den man vielleicht noch ein bisschen genauer sprechen könnte, auch jetzt hier, der wird ihm durch diesen deutschen Kommentator zugeschrieben und das ist halt ich finde, ein weiteres Beispiel für fundamentales Missverstehen oder Misslesen, von denen wir auf dieser Konferenz jetzt in vielen Kontexten gehört haben, aber ich glaube, das ist eins. Ja, vielleicht belasse ich es jetzt erstmal dabei. Ich lasse erstmal dazu als Antwort auf diese Frage nach Deutschland und Baldwin.
Do you want to respond to that? I mean,
Yeah.
now I'll go back to English. No, it is fundamentally interesting to kind of imagine a German reading of Black-Jewish relations in a specific neighborhood of New York in a specific time, and to read it through a lens of how Germans think about Jews or Jewish issues or Jewish suffering exclusively through that lens. I don't know if that's shifted in the US either in reading that text by Baldwin, or is that a text that is understood in the, like, is that something that would be controversial now, or is there a discourse around Black anti-Semitism in the US now that, like this?
Well, I think the text, as I tried to say, the headline is it's deceptive in ways because the whole article was written in the context of him resigning from a Black magazine because he thought the articles were anti-Semitic, right? So the context of the whole piece was actually a rebuke, right, of Black anti-Semitism, but the headline, right, makes him seem as though he's like justifying it. I think that the text is, I wouldn't say controversial. I think it remains a challenging text in the United States. I don't think it's one of Baldwin's texts that is constantly circulated by any means. The Fire Next Time, from which Letter from a Region of My Mind was ultimately published in, other texts of his. But yeah, I guess I just haven't confronted that, mostly because I think it reflects, as you said, there's a sense that there's a kind of helicoptering into a single quote and using that as the basis for something, when in fact, James Baldwin's writing all the way, his whole career is plagued by his life, really, this struggle to triangulate basically like three groups of Jews. The Jews that were in the Old Testament of his father's storefront church, right? The Hebrews of the Bible, so to speak, the figural Jews, right? Then the real Jews in the streets that he interfaced with, who were landlords and shopkeepers, right? And then finally, when he went to high school in the Bronx at DeWitt Clinton High School, he suddenly met a third group that he had to triangulate of these kinds of leftist intellectual and artistic Jews who then became lifelong collaborators and friends. And so his whole life is trying to kind of triangulate these different levels and social relations. And it's important, I think, to read his work in that context.
This really made me think about how I feel like, my impression, obviously I'm not from the States, but I've lived there for a few years now, and my impression is that it would be actually almost the opposite, that it would be kind of controversial for a white Jewish person to, if a white Jewish person were to seriously compare that situation, actually as Baldwin touches on in the essay you're talking about, of like Jewish, whatever, more wealthy Jewish people saying to poor black people, like, I know what it's like to suffer, and that being obviously like deeply galling. So I have the impression it's actually completely inverted, and that makes me wonder if people just like the idea of kind of being attached to some grand history. Like everyone likes to think that their own personal national narrative is the definitional one or whatever. I mean, it's a dumb point, but I do wonder if everyone just likes to feel important. So you're like, ours must be the global thing. It also makes me think of how people just aren't. I mean, I think which is the point of the essay of Baldwin's essay about the Jews in the neighborhood where he grew up, who were small business owners or landlords or whatever. I feel like there's a kind of like lack of realism about how people might respond emotionally to their immediate material circumstances. Of course, if all the examples of white Jews you meet are people who are in positions of power over you, it seems kind of even inevitable that you might draw some conclusions from that. And I don't know if that necessarily means the person is like profoundly bigoted and whatever. And I feel like it's kind of funny because Jews and Germans in the whole kind of perpetrator-victim discourse are extremely moved by their own, historical position in the ways that relates to their own circumstances, but it seems that isn't really extended to how other people might also be moved by their experience to the same degree. So that's kind of, I guess, some sort of like plea for a sort of, I guess kind of weird form of universality where it's like it's going to be fractured, but according to the same kinds of logic or whatever. Yeah, I also wanted to talk about communism, but that's just going to be a weird segue, so I'll just leave it for now, sorry.
No,
you were going to speak. We'll get to it.
Zu Kommunismus, wir kommen gleich zu Kommunismus.
Communism afterwards.
Ich mache kurz den Pausenclown, bevor der Kommunismus kommt. Ich würde gerne anschließen an
Socialism.
Real existierender Socialism sogar. Also ich würde gerne kurz anschließen, Ben, an deine Unterscheidung der 3 jüdischen Gruppen bei Baldwin. Ich kriege die jetzt, glaube ich, nicht ganz so super sortiert, aber was ich mitgebracht habe, ist der Blick auf 2 sehr frühe Texte von Baldwin, beide von 1948. Einer Fiction, einer Non-Fiction. Und ich glaube, dass alle deine 3 Gruppen da vorkommen. Das eine ist eine Kurzgeschichte, Previous Condition, und das andere Essay, The Harlem Ghetto. Der letztere ist bekannter als diese erste Kurzgeschichte. Die Kurzgeschichte, da gibt es im Zentrum einen Protagonisten, der ist Mitte 20, Schauspieler, arm, super arm aufgewachsen. Der hat auch eine Freundin. Interessanter ist sein Freund, der dann noch auftaucht. Der heißt Jules Wiseman und ist jüdisch. Jener Freund, Wiseman, also sprechender Nachname, der stellt dem schwarzen Schauspieler, diesem armen Schauspieler, eine Wohnung zur Verfügung. Allerdings in Downtown, in New York City Downtown, das heißt in einer weißen Neighborhood. Und eigentlich fühlt er sich von Beginn an bedroht, versucht sich zu verstecken, aber irgendwann kommt die Landlady, entdeckt ihn und schmeißt ihn raus. Also die Befürchtung wird erfüllt. Er geht dann kampfeslos und danach kommt es, das ist interessant, zu einer Unterhaltung zwischen diesem jüdischen Jules und dem schwarzen Peter. Und der jüdische Freund fragt den Schwarzen: Hast du denn gekämpft? Hast du Widerstand geleistet? Hast du ihr ein paar schlechte Momente gemacht? Und er sagt völlig resigniert: Nein, so, ich hatte da keine Kraft zu. Und diese Unterhaltung ist deswegen so interessant weil ich könnte jetzt nacherzählen, dauert zu lange, aber die ist interessant, weil ich glaube, dass der jüdische Freund, der ihm geholfen hat, der ihm gut verbunden ist und so, dass der so eine Art von auch Universalismus, jüdischem Universalismus repräsentiert. Der sagt so, wir sitzen doch alle in einem Boot, während der schwarze Schauspieler das nicht so richtig annehmen kann, auch aus Selbsthass. Dem geht das alles auf die Nerven. Warum kriege ich nicht einfach eine Wohnung, so wie alle eine Wohnung kriegen? Und warum kannst du nicht verstehen, dass es ein Unterschied ist, dass ich so depoverished und black bin und lalala. Also diese Reibung zwischen, wir sitzen alle in einem Boot und ich bin trotzdem was Besonderes, die ist irgendwie ein bisschen in dieser Kurzgeschichte da und die erinnert oder die kommt her, ist verbunden mit der Gruppe, die du gerade genannt hast, seine Freunde. Also es ist eine private, individuelle, freundschaftliche Beziehung. Das andere nur ganz, ganz kurz, was ich glaube, was man in diesem Essay The Harlem Ghetto sehen kann, was diese jüdisch-schwarzen Beziehungen angeht. Ich glaube, dass die geprägt sind in Baldwins Augen von einer tiefen Ambivalenz. Also auf der einen Seite nicht nur Anziehung, wie in dieser Freundschaft, sondern sogar Identifikation. Also die Schwarzen sagen, wir sind wie die Juden, wir sind Juden. Und das wiederum, genau, andere Gruppe aus deinen 3 jüdischen Gruppen, wegen der hebräischen Bibel. Weil fast alles, was in diesen christlichen Kirchen in Harlem gepredigt wird, aus deren Sicht alttestamentarische, heute würde man halt auch als Christ eher sagen, hebräische biblische Texte sind, mit einem Schlagwort gesagt, let my people go. So, das sind die. Und auf der anderen Seite eben dieser Neid und Mistrust, den der Alltag der Landlords und so weiter mit sich bringt. Und diese 2 Seiten, Identifikation einerseits und auf der anderen Seite das, was Ben Verschiedentliches beschrieben hat mit der Alltagserfahrung damals in diesem Harlem der 30er, 40er Jahre. Ich glaube, das stellt Baldwin von Anfang an, der ist da 24, als fundamental für diese deutsch-schwarzen Beziehungen dar. Und ich finde auch interessant, dass bei allen Changes, die es da gegeben haben mag, bei Baldwin, dass diese Ambivalenz, glaube ich, konstant bleibt. Ich glaube, das bleibt so. Ich glaube, das kann man noch bei ganz späten Texten, selbst aus den 80ern, wo er, so wie du es auch beschrieben hast, radikaler auf eine Weise geworden ist. Aber selbst da gibt es noch diese Ambivalenz.
It's interesting because, I mean, first of all, in Germany, we don't really do context well with anti-Semitism, and this obviously requires some context. The specific issue of white Jewish landlords in Harlem is something that you would have to understand that this isn't about Germans in that particular, it's not, as a German to complain about white Jewish landlords
well,
is
of course there's no Jewish landlords here. They fucking got rid of all of them, didn't they, and stole their property.
That's exactly
so
right,
really
but we have
solved the problem of Jewish landlords.
No, this is no context. But it's also interesting, sorry, we're allowed these jokes. But it's, I think it also gets to the heart of another thing that doesn't translate well into German, another context that's entirely lost, which I wanted to also ask you about, Hannah, because you don't only know the US, but you also know the UK, AKA formerly part of Europe. So we'll just assume that we'll just say Europe. So, UK, Europe, and the US.
Insensitive.
Sorry, it's fine. You're going to get your German passport and we'll teach you about it. You'll bring context
my
back to
mum's
Germany.
applying for the Holocaust passport because they've now expanded the criteria to the point, like her mother wouldn't have technically, anyway, whatever, it doesn't matter, but I just think it's really
She's
funny
joining
how
us.
they keep expanding the requirements. I call it the fuck the Turks passport. But, various people who've had more issues trying to acquire a German passport. But I don't know, so actually, probably other people can speak, because the UK context has gone insane since I left.
I just meant
don't know.
specifically about the idea that Jews in a U.S. context are white or considered, or white Jews are considered white. I mean, at least in Germany, that's not
This has been
the
a
same way.
lifelong
But, yeah.
fight for me personally, because when I was a kid, my mum would be like, I'm not white, I'm Jewish, and me and my brother would be like, this has been like a lifelong battle, and I feel like I'm constantly pulled back and forth, and I don't know, I mean, maybe it doesn't really matter. I mean, they're definitely not black, so, I mean, although actually there's interesting, I guess, Moten talks about like the blackness of Karl Marx or whatever, so you could kind of expand. I was actually just having a thought about how I wasn't, because of the Holocaust, I was not raised religious by my Jewish mother. No, sorry, I mean, but that's kind of true. But like, and because of communism, which we could get to. But so I was astonished. A couple of, as an adult, I've started doing seders for Passover, but very kind of deconstructed or whatever. Like we just like talk about liberation or whatever. But like, so I was astonished a couple of Passovers ago to hear from a friend who was, is much more familiar with the religious practice of Judaism and so on. She was like, well, of course the Jews were never actually slaves in Egypt. And we were all like, what? And she's like, no, it's good. It's because it's all about identification. It's about, she was like, well, maybe we could have been slaves in like Babylon, like a long time before that, or like what apparently a lot of people just know this. I didn't know this. So you could say that the entire religion is based on a practice, which is kind of, a practice of comparison and identification with the position of the oppressed, which would make this whole thing, somewhat ironic. And one of the many ways it's ironic or whatever. But Yeah, I mean, clearly, like, I think it was also about America as a kind of particular kind of settler colony, and obviously some of this was covered in the previous talk and so on. Obviously, like, Jews have become white partly through the function of America. I mean, I have a, like, stupid habit when, like, especially when Jewish friends from Europe visit the States or come to the States for the first time, I show them the pie chart of Jewish populations on Wikipedia, which is a bit ideologically fucked up because I think they take the kind of Israeli citizenship criteria as like who's Jewish or not or whatever. So it's like not beyond criticism, but it's just, I mean, it's just crazy. There's so many, I know this is so basic, but there's so many more Jews in America and they're so concentrated in New York City, and it's a much more, you really feel how much America was this kind of other place, and there's even the ways that the Holocaust can then be narrativized and the ways it can be thought about become totally different through this whitening effect that happened through America and joining the kind of colonial project of the USA. So I don't know, it just seems like that's a big part of like contemporary Jewish history, and that's kind of what's it's maybe America is the real Israel, kind of, in some ways.
Next year in Brooklyn.
Sorry, New York is the real Israel.
Do you want to say something?
Sure. I mean, I think, yeah, this is something that on a less personal level, but I also, have struggled, have fought for years, right? Which is this, this kind of claim to, this individual claim to non-whiteness, as if that's how racialization works, right? Just like, or kind of basing, using kind of racial theories that were promulgated maybe in, 1932 in Germany to make a claim about racialization in the United States, right, which just doesn't make any sense. So I think that I imagine that part of the difficulty is just comes around not even anything to do with Jews, but trying to just an understanding of settler colonial whiteness, right, and what that is, right, and where it comes from, and how it's constituted. The United States was founded, had a naturalization law in 1790 that defined its citizenship as free white persons. That's what it meant to be a citizen. What did that mean? I mean, as many scholars have pointed out, what whiteness meant was that you could help put down a slave rebellion or an indigenous raid, right? And so it's collapsed in a way with just the very practice of being a settler, right? Now, in the debates that are recorded in the Annals of Congress from 1790, you see that the representatives explicitly discussed the eligibility of Catholics and Jews into this category, and they concluded, yes, absolutely. They said, we don't want to be like Europe. In Europe, they have all this religious intolerance, right? This is the land of the free, quote unquote, and so we will welcome Jews and Catholics, right, as free white persons. Now, of course, European Jews here we're talking about. And so that's 1790, right? And so I know that that's surprising even for some people who have also kind of latched onto a kind of popular narrative that Jews became white or something, right, in the post-war world. And of course, there's different, when we talk about race and whiteness, there are different dimensions here, right? Are we talking about the law? Right? Are we talking about the street, like how people on the street are racializing people, right? Are we talking about practices of violence, right, or policing, right? So race can function differently, right, in all of those frames, but at least in terms of the federal government's juridical conception of the American citizen, right, it's explicit in the Annals of Congress that certain Jews, I mean, it's a tautology, but white Jews were included as white. And that's my starting point. And so then it's like, that's why I think it becomes this question of debating whether or not, Jews are or aren't white really is in a way a diversion from really actually just understanding settler colonial whiteness, what it is, why it's still here.
Ich würde die These wagen, ich weiß nicht, was ihr dazu sagen würdet, würde mich interessieren, dass aus der Perspektive von James Baldwin würde man zu dieser Whiteness-Frage ungefähr Folgendes sagen können. Wenn es Schwarze gibt in diesem Harlem, die Juden hassen oder denen misstrauen oder so, dann tun sie das nicht, weil diese Juden jüdisch wären, also nicht wegen ihrer Jüdischkeit, damit hat es gar nichts zu tun, sondern nur insofern sie sich genauso verhalten wie das weiße Amerika. Also ich glaube, das wäre so eine Antwort aus seiner Perspektive, die unter anderem mal was extrem Relationales hat, also gar nichts Essentialistisches, sondern in der Beziehungen denkt. Und vielleicht noch eine kleine Bemerkung, ich weiß jetzt nicht, wo die hinführt, die fällt mir jetzt nur gerade noch ein. Die beiden Texte, die ich jetzt angeguckt habe, sind älter noch als die du angeschaut hast, 1948. Das ist das Jahr der Gründung Israels. Das ist das Jahr auch der Nakba. Das ist das Jahr in Deutschland des Parlamentarischen Rates und so. Und die Wolfszeit geht hier zu Ende und so. Das spielt da alles 0, 0, 0, 0 eine Rolle. Und nicht mal der Holocaust wird explizit erwähnt, sondern der geht wirklich, um das nochmal zu betonen, von der situierten Beziehung zwischen zwei Bevölkerungsgruppen in diesem Harlem aus. Ich finde das deswegen interessant anzugucken. Also man könnte sich ja fragen, warum guckt man sich so einen alten Text an, der so gar nichts mehr mit unseren Verfasstheiten zu tun hat oder so. Einfach, ich finde es interessant, weil es so anders ist. Weil es einen auf die Idee bringen kann, dass die Frontverläufe mal anders waren. Weil es einen vermittelt auf die Idee bringen kann, die Frontverläufe können auch wieder anders werden, als sie im Augenblick sind. Das ist dann vielleicht die Zeit für den Kommunismus.
Communism. If you want to talk about, do you want to talk about communism?
Oh yeah, I mean, I just, I guess thinking about what the value of the identification, the relation between, I don't know, Ben will obviously be able to speak to this in more detail, but the thinking about the relation between Black radical struggles and like Jewish radicals obviously brings up the question that you kind of referred to. These aren't just about, it's not just about comparison, and it's not even just about like who's oppressed in what way by what system and so on. It's also about a kind of potential shared political project. And I think one of the, this is maybe just a really like general point on the problem of a lot of these discussions, and it goes back to something I think Dr. Gilman said on the first day about how these symbolic systems aren't really subject to logic, but there's a way that without a grounding in like an actual sort of politics, then you're kind of just left with these more symbolic kind of expressions, which is sort of what's unfortunately that seems to have been the fate of the Holocaust discourse. Kind of, it's either fused to a kind of like repressive or a project, or it just becomes purely symbolic, and that's because it's been I think. Nazism has been so heavily detached from, it just feels like that the Nazism as a kind of anti-communism kind of gets completely detached from the entire discussion, and like communism as to some degree, something that Jews are invested in or might have something to do with kind of like European Jewry kind of also gets like excised, and I think that must be part of what you're thinking about when you're looking at like Black radicalism, and it's like kind of overlaps within the kind of third category of Jews I think you mentioned. I assume a lot of them were socialists and communists and so on. But
Yeah, and there's a whole ongoing debate about Baldwin's relationship to socialism or not. But yeah, it's in those early, at the time of the Harlem Ghetto essay is when really was his most kind of explicit phase, you might say, of that. And yeah, these guys from DeWitt Clinton High School who really were lifelong collaborators. He co-wrote plays with them, were definitely kind of coming out of this, especially the interwar period, right, where the Communist Party in the United States consisted of only Black and Jewish people. That's an exaggeration, but that was the reality of the beginnings of the chapters of the Communist Party. And so, I think that the question of this shared project. In general, I would say, shifting the frame to a kind of shared conversation is so important, because part of the problem, even with this frame of Black-Jewish relations, right, is this presupposition that these are kind of two discrete groups. Now, certainly in the context of what many people experienced in Harlem, there was clearly one group that you paid rent to and, another group that was living there. But there were also Black Jewish congregations in Harlem, right, and in other cities, right? And so that's sort of one of the elements that we kind of bracket or put out of view in order to construct this sort of narrative of Black-Jewish relations, right, and creating a kind of shared conversation as they happened then in the interwar period. In the interwar period, they're having this shared conversation. These Yiddish poets are writing poetry about the Scottsboro Boys. They're writing poetry in Yiddish about lynchings, right? And they're having this shared conversation really clearly. And then, I think that you're right, that there's a kind of depoliticization of Nazi crimes, right? That lends itself also to an inability to make a kind of political comparison then from black militancy to the Holocaust, if that makes sense, right? So that by depoliticizing Nazism into this hate, it's hate. You know, they were just so hateful, right?
For no reason.
Is part of, right, this inability then to think about the Holocaust as a comparative object that has political implications, right, and that you can make a political argument out of.
Nun eine winzige Fußnote zu etwas, was vor 4 Minuten hier, glaube ich, gesagt wurde, nämlich dass The Harlem Ghetto und auch diese Kurzgeschichte zuerst erschienen sind in Commentary, also dieser jüdischen Zeitschrift, mit der Baldwin eng zusammengearbeitet hat und die übrigens auch, wenn ich das richtig in Erinnerung habe, vom American Jewish Comedy gegründet wurde, nur damals zu der Zeit noch nicht rechts war, sondern eher links.
Yeah, I mean, it was commentary was, for people not familiar, was hugely influential in the kind of anti-Stalinist left, and it was kind of a refuge for a lot of the Jewish intellectuals who had sort of turned away from the Communist Party since then. But huge influential publication.
Do we have any questions? We're I think behind time anyway. If there are, I think we could have a very brief Q&A, or we could have a very brief break.